There is a lot of influential people in history that we have to thank today. One of those people is Paul Revere, who we will be learning about today in this video. Before we get started, let's pump up the jams. Revere's exact date of birth is unknown, but it is known that he was born at the end of 1734 in North End, Boston, Massachusetts. Fun fact: there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to the birth date of Paul Revere. Many people say that his birthday was January 1st, 1735. However, this is incorrect. This date actually marks the day that he was baptized. Paul Revere was born to Apollos Revere and Deborah Hitchborn. Revere's father, Apollos, was born and raised in France. He, however, had to immigrate to America to escape religious persecution. Revere married Sarah Orne in 1757. However, Sarah sadly passed away in 1773. A few months later, after Sarah's death, Paul married Rachel Walker. With both women, he had 8 children, having a total of 16 children. Revere had 10 siblings and was the second oldest. Revere's father was a silversmith. Throughout Revere's childhood, his father trained him to continue on the family custom of being a silversmith. As a child, Revere's father enrolled him in the biggest and best school in Boston, so then one day, he could take over the shop. At 19, Revere's father died, which gave Paul the huge responsibility of handling the family business. Prior to the American Revolution, Revere, aged 21, fought in the Provincial Army, 1756, in New York during the French and Indian War. He even became the second lieutenant for the Colonial Artillery. He, however, did not serve for a long time after a failed mission. The Stamp Act of 1765 got Revere more politically involved. Because of this, he became a patriot and a political leader. This is shown by his many memberships of political Whig groups. Some of these Whig groups include the Sons of Liberty, the North End Caucus, the Long Room Club, and the Masonic Lodge of St. Andrews. It is also shown by his participation in multiple patriot movements/actions that will be listed now. In 1770, Paul became a part of the Whig Patriots. Here, he was a messenger for the Boston Committee of Safety. Also in 1770 was the Boston Massacre, where Paul Revere's drawing of the event became propaganda that drew in thousands towards the patriot cause. Even today, this engraving still holds a lot of significance, as it is one of the most recognized images of the Revolution. In the year of 1773 was the Boston Tea Party. Revere actually participated in the throwing of tea into the Boston Harbor. In fact, he was actually a leader of the Boston Tea Party. However, he was one of the 2 patriots that were publicly identified for being involved. As stated before, Revere was a messenger for the Boston Committee of Safety. Around the time that the Tea Act was passed, he would ride out to notify communities to not allow certain ships to land or unload. After the Boston Tea Party, Revere became a writer for the Committee of Correspondence. He also formed a new spy group that was made up of unemployed artisans. This group was called the Mechanics. The Mechanics would watch every British troop in Boston and collect every movement that they would make. Before we move on to another thing that Paul Revere did, I want you to hear this poem and see if you can recognize it. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. This poem was created by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow about the midnight ride of Paul Revere. In 1774, the Coercive Acts were passed and closed down the Boston Harbor. Because of the closing of the Boston Harbor, 2,000 to 3,000 more soldiers were sent to Boston to guard the port. This gave major anxiety to the colonists in Boston. As a result, they started to stockpile weapons. However, they could not keep them in Boston because the majority of soldiers were in Boston. So they stored them in Concord and Worcester. Once General Gage, who was the commander of British forces and governor of Massachusetts, found out about this, he secretly sent troops to Concord to seize these arms. Mechanics saw this movement and reported it. With this information, a signal was sent out in the steeples of Boston's North Church. If one lantern was lit, that meant that the troops were moving inland, while 2 lanterns meant that they were going by sea. In the church, there were 2 lanterns lit because the troops crossed the Charles River. This signal was actually meant for Dr. Joseph Warren, a son of Liberty. Warren sent William Dawes for the midnight ride, making Williams the first man to be sent out on the midnight ride. Paul Revere was sent out later. On the night of April 18, 1775, around 10 to 11 p.m., Paul Revere and William Dawes separately rode out to alert the colonial militia. They were both riding out to Lexington to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock. After warning Samuel Adams and John Hancock, both Dawes and Revere were captured and arrested. A third rider was then sent out, named Samuel Prescott. He was the one who warned Concord. With the information provided by Dawes and Revere, Adams and Hancock were able to make it to Concord to organize the militia. A few hours later, on April 19, 1775, around 4:30 a.m., the British Army was unexpectedly met by the colonial militia at Lexington Town Green. In this encounter, only 10 militiamen were injured, and 5 were killed. While on the British side, only 1 was killed. After this encounter, the British continued on with their mission of reaching Concord. When they finally arrived, they found little weapons. They then started to march back to Boston. As they were marching back, there were multiple militiamen hidden. From this surprise attack, 273 British soldiers died, while only 95 militiamen passed. These 2 battles are known as the Battles of Lexington and Concord, which was the beginning of the Revolutionary War. In the Revolutionary War, Paul Revere served as a lieutenant colonel of artillery in the Massachusetts militia. He also manufactured and provided gunpowder and cannons for the war. Revere also made and printed the first currency in Massachusetts. As you can see, Revere played multiple roles in the Revolution, such as messenger, soldier, lieutenant, artisan, spy, and commander. Revere was important to the Revolution for multiple reasons. For example, with his art and participation in protests, he was able to draw in thousands of more people towards the Patriot cause. Also, with his messages, he was the reason why the Americans won the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And since this battle was the start of the American Revolution, without Paul Revere, there wouldn't have been an American Revolution, and eventually, American independence. And lastly, the printing of the money that he created for Massachusetts was able to financially support the Patriots military. Today, Paul Revere is remembered in history as an American folk hero. This is because he's most known for the story of the Midnight Ride, which was based on Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, which has a lot of historical inaccuracies. Firstly, after Paul Revere's ride, no one remembered it. In fact, it was nowhere mentioned in his obituary. It wasn't until 100 years after his ride when Wadsworth wrote that poem that got Revere some recognition for his heroic act. In this poem, it states that Paul Revere was the only one who rode for the Midnight Ride. However, there were 3 important men on that ride, and by the time that Prescott rode out, there was a total of 50 riders already warning the local militias. Another myth is that Paul Revere yelled throughout the towns that the British were coming. This, however, could not have been. Firstly, he couldn't have yelled because this was a discreet mission that the British soldiers could not know about. And since there were many soldiers in Massachusetts, they would have heard him. And not only that, but they would have captured him, since he was causing a ruckus throughout the middle of the night. Also, Paul Revere never said that the British are coming. That would have been too confusing. This is because, during this time, some colonists still referred to themselves as British. If anything, he probably would have said, "The regulars, redcoats, or lobsters are coming." Today, there are many landmarks, memorials, and buildings made in honor of Paul Revere, but the most famous one is the equestrian statue of Paul Revere, created by Cyrus Edwin Dolan. This sculpture is also one of the most photographed sculptures in Boston. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something today about Paul Revere.